Hello, I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and welcome to Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Today we're talking about the problem of alcohol outlet density. When high-risk populations are targeted by people and businesses that exploit risk factors, problems can grow, whether we're talking about drug dealers or liquor stores. Now, positive change is possible with a little help from our friends and good science. One of our friends and good scientists is here to talk about the issues, Sean Dorius from Iowa State University. Sean, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and why you're here today.
Great. Thanks for having me here today, Peter. So I'm a social scientist, and I'm at Iowa State University in Ames, and I'm a rural sociologist in the College of Agriculture. And one of the areas that I work in is this area of community health and well-being. And I get a chance to drive all around the state and talk to people in different communities and see what's working and what's not, and where people are feeling really good about their lives in the future and where they're worried and struggling. And one of the things that I've learned in those conversations, and as a scientist staring at lots of data, is we've got some problems flowing from alcohol, and it needs a little extra attention. And I think kind of, put a positive spin, there's lots of opportunities to make things a little better in communities and families around the state.
When you say there's problems flowing from alcohol, what kind of problems are you talking about?
Well, they come in lots of different scales. There's individual problems. I've done interviews with people who are in treatment centers for addiction, and I've done work with folks in focus groups and talking out on the streets, people who have challenges, personal problems, people who've experienced a lot of domestic violence flowing from excess alcohol use. I've stared a lot at transportation data and seeing that we've got crashes all over the state, car crashes that lead to fatalities that are alcohol related. And then we look at communities and we talk to police officers and other safety officers, and we see that there's concentration of calls for service, reactive services, and strains and demands on public infrastructure flowing directly and indirectly from harmful alcohol consumption. So it happens at lots of levels. Individuals, families, communities, and our infrastructure can all take a hit from some harmful use or excess use.
Well, let's try to cut to some of the hard issues. You've got what we might call, for the sake of discussion, good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods. Where a bad neighborhood might simply say higher crime rate, higher population density, any number of things that you would probably know better than I would. And interestingly enough, when we look at where most of these liquor outlets are, they tend to be more in what we might think of as more challenging or bad neighborhoods. Is that the case?
It is the case across the country. When social scientists and public health folks and epidemiologists like myself, when we look at these data, we look at neighborhoods that are either places where crime is prevalent or whether other kinds of challenges, vulnerability, high foreclosure rates and few resources, the kinds that make community life nice. Those kind of communities they tend to have a lot more alcohol outlets. They tend to have more bars. They tend to have more gas stations selling liquor and more liquor stores. And that's not by chance. There's a phrase out there that many people know, NIMBY, the not in my backyard. And neighborhoods like the one I live in, there aren't any gas stations right there selling alcohol. There's no bars that have nightly fights. It's not my neighborhood, but there are neighborhoods in my community that are like that. And unfortunately, there's a concentration of challenges, and it's not about the people, it's about the place. And that's kind of one of the things that I've been trying to better understand as a scientist, but also to communicate to the communities across Iowa is the place matters. This issue about harmful alcohol use, we very quickly get to saying it's people making bad choice. And often we say bad people making bad choices. Well, there's good and bad people out there, and there's good and bad choices. But there's environments that make decisions easier, harder, and there's environments that make things more or less safe. And that's what we've really been looking at with this alcohol outlet density problem, is looking at the environment in which our kids are growing up and going to school, in which people play and even party. And is it a safe environment or is it a risk environment?
Yeah, one thing that other guests have pointed out on the show is that whether it's drugs, alcohol, tobacco, access is a huge factor. That if it's easily accessible and it's in your face, it's more likely to be used and abused. And people that are economically challenged and live in neighborhoods where the rents might be lower and crime might be higher, they're not bad people. And many of them may be struggling with things like addiction. Is it? It sounds like the sort of proliferation of these businesses in those areas is predatory. That it's actually contributing to the problem directly. Is that true?
I can't speak to the motives of the establishment operators and the establishments that sell liquor or license. I should minimum say license to sell alcohol, beer, and wine and spirits. They vary. All there's all kinds. There's the mom and pop shop that has a bed and breakfast and has a license to sell wine. There's the Elks Club that has a license to have beer at the annual events. There's just every kind of range. There's liquor stores that sell lots and lots of alcohol. That's all they do. There's gas stations that sell many other things. And then maybe one of our biggest sales points is Sam's Clubs, Walmart's, Hy-Vee's, our big grocery chains. So they come in different sizes and shapes, and some are big multinational firms and some are small mom and pop shops. So the background, the people behind those establishments, they really vary. But what we do know is through a whole bunch of phenomenon, these outlets do get concentrated in vulnerable neighborhoods. By and large, these outlets are in tough neighborhoods.
I want to really drill down to that problem because it doesn't sound like a great thing that we see them proliferating in neighborhoods that face more challenges. Stay tuned. We'll take a short break and we'll continue our conversation with Sean Dorius. You don't want to miss this.
The black truck? Hey, Christina from accounting.
Yeah, hi.
Hey, I used to date a girl named Christina.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then she dumped me for my best friend. You want to see some photos of them that I took?
I don't.
I thought we talked about this, buddy.
Buzz and overshared again?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna call a car.
That's a smart idea.
So yeah, I know, that's why I did it.
Hey, you're gonna get back to the top of the mountain.
Does that mean I'm gonna get back with Christina?
No.
Oh.
No.
While a lot is changing in our world, at MediaCom, our focus remains the same, making sure you have the fastest, most reliable connection possible. During this critical time, we know your needs are changing. You may be working or learning from home, relying on telemedicine, or finding new ways to keep everyone entertained. If you need more speed, call or go online, and MediaCom will double your speed immediately for as low as $10 more a month for 1 year.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're talking with Sean Dorius from Iowa State University about alcohol outlet density and the science behind community health improvement. Sean, stage is yours.
Thanks. So one of the things that we've been working on for the state is we've been trying to collect information on where alcohol outlet establishments are, where you can see where they're in high concentration and where problems are associated with those. And I'll just show you quickly here on the screen what that might look like. This is a statewide view, and these blue and green dots are on and off premise outlets. And the most important thing we can take away here is alcohol outlets and these establishments are all across the state. Where you see big clusters of them, that's our big cities where you have big clusters of people. But mostly this tells us you can kind of go anywhere in the state and you can be exposed to an alcohol outlet density. When you zoom in on any particular city, like here, we'll jump in and look at Fort Dodge here. You can see the town itself, and you can see clusters and concentrations of these outlets. And in fact, when we map those, you can see these densities and clusters. And this is really what we've been interested to look at, because where you have a lot of outlets in high density next to each other, you tend to have problems. For example, one of the problems that we know comes from that is car crashes. And so we've layered data on here where you can see, are there clusters of car crashes near the densities? And we can do that for any state, any city in the state. And that's been helpful for driving decision making. It helps local communities make good decisions to keep their communities safe.
Now, how about other types of crime besides car crashes? Are there also correlations to these locations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, if you don't mind, I'll show you just one more here. We've been working with 4 communities in Iowa, and we've been working with their local police departments to understand questions about, are these alcohol outlets and their densities, are they associated with other kinds of community harms? And so we built some maps for each of those 4 cities, including Cedar Rapids here. And what I've got here is a map showing violent crime calls for service. So when the police get a call and say there's a stabbing, there's a shooting, there's an assault, that call gets recorded, and we've been able to collect all that together and build a map. And so those dark brown areas are neighborhoods in Cedar Rapids where you have a lot of calls for violent crimes. And the light shaded areas are where you have very few calls for violent crime. And then what I've done here is I've overlaid on top of that, we'll just turn a few more on, I've overlaid on top of that the alcohol outlets. And I'll zoom in a little bit so we can get a little bit closer picture. What you can see is the neighborhoods here, these are the darkest color shaded areas. These are the areas with the highest amount of crime. And that's also where we have the highest concentration of alcohol outlets. And when we test that statistically, that's not by chance. And that's not a story just of Cedar Rapids. That story is true in every community that we've looked at. Where you have a high concentration of alcohol outlets, you also have a high concentration of calls for service related to violent crime. And that's a huge challenge.
Now, I'm guessing that in many instances, these areas that show the high density of outlets and high density of crime, there might also be schools in those areas.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we've been looking at schools as well. And part of the reason is the research shows that when you have a lot of alcohol outlets, and especially the advertisements and signage and access near where kids go to school and where they live and where they play, places like parks and playgrounds, schools, and the neighborhoods with children, you do have an increase in underage drinking, and that underage drinking leads to lifelong alcohol-related harms. Much more likely those kids that grow up in those neighborhoods to die early from liver disease and other diseases and cancers related to alcohol use. I'll show you one here. I think Burlington's a really good example of this. What I've got here is a map of Burlington, and I've got the alcohol outlets, and the densities are shaded here in blue and green. The dots are the outlets, alcohol establishments. And then I've got all the schools in the city are in these purple triangles here. And what you can see is right here, we've got an outlet density, a cluster of on-premise and off-premise alcohol outlets. That's the bars and taverns and grocery stores and gas stations, all the kind of places you can get alcohol. And they're clustered all around, these schools are clustered all around them. We've got two schools sitting right in an alcohol cluster there. So, as I think about talking to people of Burlington, city administrators and decision makers, I'd certainly be telling them, you've got a risk area there. You got to be really thoughtful about what to do there. And, in a perfect world, you're looking to minimize the amount of contact kids have with those kinds of risk factors.
Yeah, and that's funny because, well, it's not funny, it's very serious. We've had many guests talk about, kids and underage drinking and the problems that exist. And the first thing they talk about is access and the fact that the kid might stop in for a candy bar, but the windows are plastered with advertisements about alcoholic beverages or even other items like kratom, CBD. There's just no limit to the risk involved there. Now, what are some of your suggestions on taking a look at this in a way? I mean, right now it looks like the simple answer is there should be less of these outlets. Is that the simple answer?
I wish I could say there were lots of simple answers. There are some clean answers, but simple solutions are challenging. But yes, if there were fewer, you'd have less crime and you'd have less risks. If there were fewer contact with children and alcohol, there'd be less underage drinking.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and we'll ask Sean to explore some more of the attributes of risky environments and some of the things we can do to help fix our communities and keep them safe for our kids. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss this.
Multiple studies have shown that marijuana can slow both driver reaction and response time, which can be really dangerous. He's here. He's here. Wait. What? I can't drive. Why? I'm high. Oh.
Every second, 127 new devices connect to the internet. You can feel it happening, our digital world expanding with every breath. We're entering a whole new era of connectivity, and MediaCom will be ready to power it with one of the nation's first 10G platforms. We'll be bringing you more speed, more capacity, more security, and the power to do more than you ever dreamed possible.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and we're talking with Sean Dorius about the dangers that can be sort of identified and maybe mitigated to help our communities, at-risk populations, and children live safer. Sean, keep going, man. This is some fun stuff.
Thanks. Well, one of the places we like to start with when we do this kind of work is as community scholars and as public health workers, is we like to, again, look at the context, put people in a context, a cultural context, a spatial context. And let me just show you a map here, because it's sometimes helpful to say what's going on in Iowa. Is it unique to Iowa? And this is a couple of maps. The map on the left shows the adult binge drinking rate for every state in the country. Those blue areas shaded in the upper Midwest, that's Iowa's in there, and in the Northeast, those are the highest drinking states in the country. And what that means is people in Iowa are among the highest binge drinkers in the country, and we're also in a high binge drinking area. And binge drinking is when you drink, for a guy, it's drinking about 5 drinks over a couple hour short period of time. For a woman, it's 4 drinks. When you drink a lot in a short period and you get very, very intoxicated, the problem there is that's when you're likely to crash your car and die. That's when you're likely to slip and fall down the stairs and get a serious injury. That's where serious abuse happens. So binge drinking leads to a lot of those injury deaths, and that's what claims young people and middle-aged people, claims people way before their time. And you can see the map on the right shows the relationship. Iowa is one of the highest underage binge drinking states in the country, and we're in a high binge drinking region. So there's a risk here that's not just in any one city or even neighborhood in Iowa, but we're in a region where it's a prevalent phenomenon. So that makes things a little more challenging, because when I talk to people in Iowa, they tend to say, well, everyone does this. This is normal, and it's kind of a true story. Everyone is. It feels like everyone is, because there's a high drinking rate around here. But other places in the country, that's not the case, and the harms flowing are lower because of it.
So when we look at a community, and now looking at both the adult and underage binge drinking that's very high in Iowa, that gives us indication that this is a generational problem, and there's no doubt that it's a problem that a lot of people are working on solving. Yeah. And little doubt in my mind, from what you've told me already, that there's a strong correlation between this problem persisting and these outlets. How does a community and schools and parents, how should they look at this information you're sharing and help make decisions? What can they do to affect some changes that may make them safer?
Great question, Peter. I mean, first and foremost, communities can do things. Decisions that we make, they do have an effect. I'll give you a couple examples. I lived for many years in the Middle East, in countries that had a religious tradition that banned alcohol. No alcohol was allowed at any kind, and drinking rates were low, and the harms that flow from that were low. We have similar variation in state here. We have states like Utah that has had a history of very low drinking rate and consequently very low harms. When we look at cities that enact policies to mitigate the harms, to reduce the harms of alcohol consumption, like limiting the density of outlets or keeping them farther from schools, when they do that and they enact those changes, harms get lower. There is a very strong, not just correlation, but a cause and effect. We make a change and things get better. When those sales increase and outlet densities increase, harms go up, violence goes up, domestic and otherwise. So there's a very clear established pattern. That means that's a good and a bad thing. It means that if we enact positive changes, we can reduce the harms.
Now, I would guess that most people living in these at-risk areas, maybe they sense it might be problematic, but they probably don't realize how critically important it is to reduce the number of outlets in their communities. So getting the word out probably seems very important.
Yeah, that's an important part of the message, is to say that there is a risk factor in your community. In most communities in Iowa, there's a risk factor, and it's a potential in some and a real in others. And that's a concentration of alcohol establishments in and around where kids work and play, but also just in and around the neighborhoods. It increases the risk. And to the extent that you enact policies, and there's a wide range of them that you can do. Planning and zoning commissions have options there. You can zone to keep communities a little safer. You can work with the Alcoholic Beverages Division on licensing. Communities have a say in whether new licenses are approved or denied. You can work on local policies. Many communities have options to limit and to manage the signage and the advertising. That's a powerful tool. We have opportunities to get education into communities. Certainly, like the Burlington one I showed you, you'd like to have policies and engagement strategies right there in those communities that we know are at high risk. And the other is more data to look and say, where are these outlets and where are the vulnerable populations? And let's separate those out. Let's not let concentrated risks overlay on neighborhoods that are already vulnerable because of limited resources and poor infrastructure and things like that. Let's shore them up with some positive work.
Those are great points. We're going to take a short break and invite Sean back to share some final comments, insights, and advice. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss this.
Today, more than ever, you need fast, reliable internet. At MediaCom, we want you to know you can count on us. Our fiber-powered 100% gigabit technology network was built for the future. We have enormous capacity and power and 99.99% network reliability. So even though these are uncertain times, we're prepared, and you can be certain we'll keep your world connected.
Whether it's advice on managing your anxiety or tools to help you stay grounded, Coping-19 provides a range of resources and self-care tips to help you cope with this pandemic. We can help. Find the resources that work best for you at coping-19.org.
Today on Surviving Bad, we're talking about the problem of alcohol outlet density and the targeting that exploits risk factors and hurts our communities. Now, positive change is possible. Let's see what advice Sean has to share. Sean?
Thanks, Peter. I want to end with some options and some levers that local communities and individuals can pull. But let me just zoom out with a screen share here and say, just remind you, it's costly. Excess alcohol consumption is costly. Some people much smarter than me have tried to quantify the costs. And as best we can tell, it's costing the state about $2.5 billion a year. And that breaks down to about $2.50 per drink. If we were to make sure alcohol pays for itself, it'd be about a $2.50 tax per drink to cover the cost. And where do those costs come from? Well, it comes from things like car crashes. It comes from things like lost productivity because employees come into work hungover or they have to call in sick. It comes because of all those reactive services. All the time our police and first responders are coming out for a bar fight and a bar check, into a car accident or to an abuse that was alcohol related. Comes from fetal alcohol syndrome and other medical costs. It flows and it manifests all over the place. And then it gets very local here. Let me see if I can move this forward for us. These are some examples. It gets very local. You know, Davenport has a bar. I've talked to some folks in Davenport. There's a bar there that's just been the repeated location for fights and for calls for service, for other kinds of problems. And it was recently shut down. It was very, very costly to the community. It did harm to the community and the neighborhood. We've had similar in other places throughout the state. And so that's an example of some of the harms. But you can make a difference in your local community. There are options to make things safer. There's certainly work at the legislative level. We hope and support the efforts at state legislatures, but you don't have to affect change at that level. You can get right down in your local community and make a difference. And like I say, the zoning laws are one, pricing is another, regulations on signage and other kinds of things. Being thoughtful about keeping those things far from children, improving the education and training of our bar and tavern workers to support knowing when and where to cut people off, and getting those bus routes close to the places where we have a lot of on-premise drinking, so people aren't driving home under the influence, that there are alternate solutions there, ride share and other things. There's lots of things we can do to minimize the harms without costing ourselves of anything economically. And that's the larger point is it's not all benefits to alcohol sales. There are real costs, and we need to mitigate those costs and harms.
Yeah, it seems ironic that we talk about sales of alcohol as creating tax revenue for the state, but the cost to the state is way higher.
Yeah.
than any revenue that's being generated. And people in at-risk communities where we see this population density dealing with the problem generationally all share similar feelings of any parent, is that they want their children to have a better world and better outcomes.
Yep.
And basically from what you're sharing, if we can reduce the density of alcohol outlets in those communities, that will empower those families to at least see a chance of a better outcome for their children.
Yeah, I was talking to a treatment provider over in Council Bluffs who is out in the schools doing education on this issue, and she told a story about one of the schools she visited. She said there's no window in that school where the kids look out and they don't see a tobacco outlet, a vape store, or an alcohol advertisement. There is no window in that school where kids are not exposed to those things. They're all risk factors for kids for long-term health. If they get into it now, they're also crossing the law. So those kinds of the stories, they're real. I talk to people who lose loved ones. I lost a close family member to alcohol. It's real. It hits down home to many, many people. Everyone I talk to in the States got a story of a family member who they've lost or who's had problems because of that. But we can do something about it. We can minimize the harms. We can reduce those if we work together. And this is the nice one is our clinical folks, our public safety people, our community leaders, individuals and families, everybody's on board with this. And so we need to work together to work on these solutions, and they're out there to be had, and they can be had right here, right now in your community.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Sean, for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us. Check out our website, ahealthyiowa.org, and keep your eye on MediaCom MC22 for our next episode of Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration on MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.